I'm 66 now, and some nights the memories come back so sharply they feel like splinters under my skin. I sit beside this old iron stove, listening to its soft ticking, and I wonder why it took me a lifetime to gather the courage to speak the truth. Maybe it's a loneliness that settles heavier with age, or maybe it's because I no longer fear the consequences of telling what I saw in those woods back in '82. All I know is that the forest kept my secret for decades, and I kept it, too. Out of loyalty, out of guilt, and out of a tenderness I never expected to feel for something so utterly different from me. The forest in those days felt endless, a cathedral of cedar columns rising into fog, so thick it turned the morning light into a pale, trembling ghost. I was 22, a ranger barely trained, grieving the fresh loss of my father and carrying more silence in me than any young man should. The woods became my refuge, my punishment, and my strange kind of home. I remember the smell of rain soaking into moss, the faint metallic sting of cold air against my teeth, the sound of distant creek water tumbling over stone. Everything out there breathed slower than the world I had left behind, and I found myself breathing slower with it, unaware of what waited just beyond my understanding. I first sensed them before I ever saw them. It was a November morning, the kind where the mist clings low and every sound feels swallowed before it reaches the treetops. I noticed a pattern of silence that didn't belong, a heaviness in the air, as though something enormous had paused its breathing just beyond the ridge. When I found the footprints, each one wider than my outstretched hand and sunk deep into mud, I felt a tremor run up my spine. Not fear exactly, but recognition, like something ancient had brushed against the edges of my life. I knelt beside one print, tracing its curve, unaware that two pairs of eyes were studying me from the shadows between the firs. I should have walked away then. Any sensible man would have reported the tracks, logged the coordinates, and left the mystery to the people paid to chase such things. But the forest had a way of pulling at the softer parts of me, the parts one pretended didn't exist. I returned the next day, and the next, drawn by an instinct I couldn't name. Food I dropped by accident, an apple half a sandwich, vanished by morning, though no raccoon tracks circled the spot. Something was taking them carefully, almost politely. And each time I found that small offering gone, I felt a quiet exchange happening between us, a conversation made of caution, hunger, and something strangely like trust. It wasn't until late December that I finally saw them, truly saw them. Snow had begun to fall in slow, soft spirals, settling on my jacket as I hiked toward the ravine. The forest felt hushed, reverent, like it was holding its breath for what came next. Out of the corner of my eye, a movement stirred the white quiet. A towering shape stooped, for silver with age, eyes deep and dark as river stone. Beside it stood another, smaller but still larger than any human, leaning slightly on the first as though strength had begun to leave its limbs. They watched me without malice, without urgency, simply standing there as though waiting for me to understand something I hadn't yet earned. I should have been terrified, but terror requires a certain kind of distance, and there was none between us. Instead, I felt an ache, a quiet recognition of age and weariness etched into their every movement. The smaller one, female, I would later realize, shifted her weight with a soft, pain grunt, and the larger turned slightly toward her, offering an arm with a tenderness that startled me. It was that gentleness, not their size, that rooted me to the spot. I didn't speak. I didn't breathe. I simply stood there, snow melting on my eyelashes, feeling the world tilt in a direction I hadn't expected. They could have vanished then, but they remained, letting me witness their fragility. When they finally moved, it wasn't away from me but slightly closer, as though acknowledging my presence rather than fleeing it. The larger one lifted a hand, massive, covered in coarse gray hair, and pressed it lightly to his chest before pointing toward the deeper woods. I didn't understand the gesture then, not fully, but it felt like an invitation, or perhaps a warning wrapped in something gentler. The female watched me with eyes that shimmered strangely in the falling snow, full of caution yet not fear. I sensed they had been waiting for someone, not because they needed help, but because age had slowed them and the world had begun closing in. I felt something shift inside me then, the first stirrings of loyalty I couldn't yet justify. I left them there in the snow, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't trust myself to step any closer. Every instinct in me screamed that I had crossed an invisible threshold, one that would bind me to their fate, whether I chose it or not. As I walked back toward the trail, I felt their eyes follow me, not accusingly, but with a kind of resigned understanding, as though they already knew I would return. The forest felt altered, charged with the truth I wasn't ready to hold. Even the wind sounded different, carrying a low, distant rumble that echoed through the branches like a voice too old to translate. That night, as I lay awake listening to the stove crackle, I realized I was no longer alone in the woods. Something had found me, something ancient, wounded, and reaching out. And if I had known what that meant, I might have stayed away the next morning. I returned to the ravine the next morning with a knot in my stomach and a thermos of hot tea trembling in my hand. The snow had settled into a thin crust that cracked beneath my boots, each sound ricocheting through the trees like a warning. I half expected the footprints to be gone, erased by wind or wishful thinking, but they were there, deeper than before, heavier. I set the thermos down on a fallen log and stepped back, feeling ridiculous and reverent in the same breath. For a long moment nothing stirred, and then the air shifted, carrying that familiar earthy scent, like wet bark and old stone. They emerged slowly, the larger one first, his breath rising and long, clouded sighs. The smaller one lingered behind him, leaning on a crooked branch as though it were a cane. They watched me with an intensity that made the back of my neck prickle, but not once did I feel malice from them, only caution and perhaps a faint, fragile curiosity. The male approached the log, sniffed the thermos, then glanced at me with an expression I could almost interpret. He lifted it gently, sniffed the steam, and set it back without taking any. It was a gentleness that undid me. No creature that size should have moved with such deliberate care, as though the world around him were breakable. I raised my hands slowly, palms open, and nodded toward the female. She was breathing hard, her shoulders trembling under the weight of age or illness. I couldn't tell which. She took a step forward, then another, until she stood close enough for me to hear the subtle rasp in her lungs. Without realizing it, I found myself whispering, "You're hurt," as though she could understand the words. Maybe she couldn't, but she sensed the intention. Her eyes softened, and when she reached out a hand to touch the air between us, my heart lodged somewhere in my throat. Over the next weeks, trust formed between us like a shy, flickering flame. They followed at a distance when I hiked the ridge trails, appearing whenever I left fruit or blankets near the clearing. I learned their rhythms, the way the male lifted his head to scent the wind before moving, the way the female touched tree trunks as though reading stories written in the bark. They taught me subtle things without meaning to. I learned that storms could be predicted not by clouds, but by the silence of certain birds. I learned the forest floor spoke if you knew how to listen. The crack of a frozen branch, the way the deer trails bent around unseen presences. But the greatest lesson they gave me came in their stillness. They moved slowly, deliberately, as though time were something to be savored rather than outrun. I envied them for that. The deeper our bond grew, the more I felt the world creeping in around the edges. It began with tire tracks near the service road, deep, wide set, not from any ranger vehicle I recognized. Then came the missing reports on my desk, pages removed from the logbook as though someone didn't want a record of strange sightings. One morning, a pair of strangers stood by the ranger station, dressed too clean to be hikers and too quiet to be harmless. They asked pointed questions about unusual wildlife activity, their voices coated in the smooth politeness that always hide a threat. I told them I'd seen nothing, felt their eyes weighing the truth under my skin, and knew the forest wasn't ours alone anymore. By January, the female's condition worsened. I found her slumped beside the ravine, her breath rattling like dry leaves caught in a gutter. The male hovered over her, pacing in tight, frantic circles. I approached slowly, every sense sharpened by fear. Her arm was warm, too warm, and her chest rose in uneven spasms. I tried offering water, but her hand shook too violently to hold the cup. The male growled, not at me, but at his own helplessness, and I felt the weight of their vulnerability press hard against my ribs. I knew then that whatever illness clung to her was beyond what herbal salves or quiet presence could mend. It was age, harsh and relentless, the kind that steals strength in thin slices. I carried wordless guilt in my chest as I returned to the station that evening. And that was when everything shifted. 2 black SUVs sat outside, their engines still warm. Inside, men in suits leaned over my desk, rifling through my reports. The moment they saw me, their expressions tightened with the confidence of people who already own the truth. They questioned me for hours, my routes, my sightings, the missing pages. When I denied knowing anything, they smiled in that slow, practiced way that says they expect a lie. They warned me that withholding information from federal authorities carried consequences. The air in the room thickened, tasting of paper and fear. That was the night I understood the forest wasn't the only one keeping secrets. In the days that followed, the woods felt hunted. I saw drones glinting between tree branches, silent as spiders. Motion sensors appeared along the trails, cleverly disguised but not enough to fool anyone who knew the land intimately. The male sensed the tension long before I did. He began leading the female along deeper paths, hiding her in hollows where the moss grew thickest. Once, I found them huddled beneath a fallen cedar, both watching me with an expression I couldn't decipher. Is it trust when fear is also there? Or is it something heavier, the kind of reliance born from desperation? I tried sabotaging the traps. I snapped branches over sensors, threw stones to redirect motion-activated lights, smudged footprints to mask their size. Each act felt like choosing a side, and maybe I couldn't help it. The bond had grown too deep. They had become more than legends. They had become lives intertwined with mine in ways I didn't yet have words for. But the harder I fought to protect them, the closer danger crept. One evening, as dusk guttered between the trees, I heard a distant crack, sharp, metallic, unmistakable. A tranquilizer dart. I ran toward the sound, heart hammering, lungs burning against the cold. Branches whipped my face, snow stunned my eyes, but I didn't stop. Something inside me already knew whose life had just tilted toward ruin. When I reached the clearing, the world felt suspended, too quiet. The male stood in the center, swaying, his chest heaving as though trying to pull breath from a world that had suddenly turned cruel. A dart jutted from his shoulder, and a ring of dark footprints circled him where agents had clearly approached and withdrawn. He looked at me with a pain I hadn't seen before, not physical, but something deeper, older. Betrayal. The female clung to him, trembling. And as I stepped forward, my boots sinking into the snow, the last thing I felt wasn't fear at all. It was a realization that the world had finally found them, and I was now the only barrier between them and whatever waited in the shadows beyond the trees. I reached the clearing with the taste of cold iron in my mouth, as though fear itself had coated my tongue. The male swayed under the weight of the tranquilizer, his breath coming in slow, ragged pulses that fogged the air in front of him. The female clung to his arm, her eyes burning with a protective fury that made her seem twice her size. I stepped between them in the dark line of figures emerging from the tree line, my hands raised, palms open, heart hammering against my ribs like it wanted to break free. The agents fanned out with the precision of wolves, their boots cracking the frozen underbrush, their weapons rising in one smooth, terrible motion. A wind swept through the clearing then, a cold, whistling breath that carried a faint scent of pine sap and fear, and for a moment I wondered if the forest itself understood what was unfolding. I shouted at the agents to stop, the sound tearing from my throat hoarse and desperate, but my voice felt small against the cold geometry of government force closing around us. The lead agent stepped forward, his face a rigid mask carved by protocol rather than humanity. He ordered me to move aside, his words clipped and practiced, as though he had rehearsed them in a mirror. I could see the dart gun trembling slightly in his hand, not from hesitation, but from adrenaline. Behind him, the others tightened their formation, the metallic clicks of safety releases echoing like distant thunder. I refused to move. The female let out a low, vibrating moan behind me, a sound layered with grief and warning. The male's knees buckled, and I caught his weight instinctively, feeling the heat of his body radiate through his fur even as the sedative dragged him downward. For the first time, the agents hesitated. The sight of a wounded giant leaning against a man half his size unsettled something in them. I saw confusion flicker across their faces, as though the script they had prepared no longer fit the scene unfolding. And in that hesitation, I sensed a sliver of hope trying to breathe. What happened next unraveled with a strange, fragile grace I still don't fully understand. The female stepped forward, her movements slow but deliberate, and placed her hand gently on my shoulder. Her breath warmed the back of my neck as she made a series of soft, rhythmic sounds, clicks, hums, and a low trill that resonated deep in my chest. It took me a moment to realize she wasn't speaking to me. She was speaking to them. The agents froze as the sound washed over the clearing, ancient and trembling, shaped by a language born long before any of us existed. Something in her voice cracked open the silence between us. And for the first time, the men lowered their weapons slightly, as though instinct itself demanded respect. The lead agent swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as he murmured into his radio. I couldn't hear the response on the other end, but his expression shifted, uncertainty replacing the rigid authority he'd worn like armor. The female stepped closer, touching her chest and then gesturing toward the forest, her eyes shimmering with a plea so clear it needed no translation. They wanted peace, not rescue, not captivity, simply a place to fade quietly beyond the reach of those who feared them. I translated what I could, stumbling over words too small for the depth of their request. But the agents listened, their features softening as the truth settled over them like falling snow. When the lead agent finally spoke, his voice carried a tremor I hadn't expected. He asked what proof he had that they weren't dangerous. My answer came without thought. I knelt beside the male, placed my hand on his chest, and told him that danger doesn't cradle the wounded. It was a gamble, but something in my tone, or perhaps the sight of the female standing protectively behind me, shifted whatever battle had been raging inside them. Slowly, painfully, the order was given, weapons down, a temporary truce. The forest exhaled as though relieved. We built a small fire under the shelter of the pines, its glow flickering across faces, human and otherwise, that had never expected to share space. The female hovered near the male, grooming the fur around the dark wound with trembling fingers. I watched her, noting the tenderness in every motion, the quiet resignation in her posture. She knew, even if we didn't, that the sedative had accelerated something far older and more relentless than any dart. While the agents made calls in hushed voices behind us, she tugged at my sleeve and pointed toward the mountains, her eyes brimming with something deeper than fear. I followed her gesture and understood. She wanted to reach the valley where their ancestors rested, a place of stone markers and ancient bones, a place they considered home. I explained this to the agents, and though they exchanged worried glances, none dared deny the request of a creature who looked at them with sorrow older than any law. As night bled across the sky, we began preparing for the journey. The male drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing labored but steady. I sat beside him, my hand resting on his, feeling the subtle vibrations of his heartbeat struggle against time. The female watched me with an intensity that felt almost like gratitude, though I doubted I deserved it. The agents grew quieter, their earlier bravado dissolving into a subdued hum of uncertainty. Even they seemed to sense we were stepping into territory where protocol meant little. When the wind shifted, carrying the distant cry of an owl, the female made a soft, keening sound and brushed her fingers against my cheek. It was a gesture so unexpectedly human that it hollowed me out. She was preparing herself, not for battle, but for goodbye. We had barely secured the stretcher for the male when a sharp crack split the air, echoing from the direction of the ridge. Not a branch, not an animal. A gunshot, one of the younger agents cursed under his breath, scanning the darkness with wide, terrified eyes. A second, harsher voice boomed through the trees. Commands barked by someone who didn't care about negotiations, someone who hadn't witnessed the fragile communion unfolding here. The female stiffened, her breast sharp and shallow, and she pressed closer to me as though I were the only solid thing left in the world collapsing around her. And in that sudden, violent shift in the air, I understood with chilling clarity that not everyone had agreed to this truce. Some forces had come not to listen, but to claim. I felt the second shot before I heard it, a violent tremor rippling through the ground as though the forest itself recoiled. The younger agents jerked toward the ridge, their faces washed pale by the cold light bleeding through the treetops. The female pressed closer to me, her breath hot and trembling against my arm, and in that moment I knew the brief, impossible peace we had carved out in the clearing was over. Shadows moved between the firs with the stiff, purposeful stride of men who arrived not to listen but to conquer. They shouted orders, their voices sharp enough to shear the quiet into ragged pieces, and I felt the world tightening around us like a noose. The male stirred weakly on the stretcher, his eyes fluttering open with confusion of someone waking into a nightmare, and the shame of being unable to protect him settled in my chest like a stone sinking through deep water. I whispered his name, though he never gave it, trying to anchor him to the world for just a little longer. The female stepped between him and the approaching figures, her posture rising into something proud, despite the exhaustion trembling through her limbs. She looked at me, not with fear, but with the painful clarity of someone who accepts the cost of love long before it comes due. Her hand brushed my chest once, firm and deliberate, a silent reminder of the promise I had made. The agents behind me raised their weapons again, torn between orders and conscience, their formations fraying as they recognized the brutality erupting from the ridge was not sanctioned by any agreement. A man in a heavier coat stormed forward, his boots carving deep scars into the snow. He waved his gun at the stretcher, barking for the creatures to be taken alive. The female snarled, the first truly feral sound I had heard from her, a sound born not of wildness but of unbearable grief. It froze every man in the clearing. Even the wind stopped to listen. Then the male tried to stand. His arm reached for me first, then for her, as if trying to close the distance between the only two beings he trusted. Each movement was a battle, his legs buckling beneath the sedative that had stolen the strength earned over decades. I caught him under the shoulder, the weight of him sinking through me like a falling tree. The female supported his other side, her fingers tightening around his wrist with a tenderness that hollowed me out. Together we lifted him, inch by painful inch, until he stood upright. The men stepped back, startled by the towering silhouette rising against the pale sky, a figure too ancient to bow even as life bled from him. His breath rattled like broken branches in winter wind. Still, he placed himself between the female, and the guns pointed in our direction. There was no mistaking the gesture. Even dying, he chose to shield her. When the third shot rang out, it struck the tree behind us, splintering bark over our shoulders. Agents screamed for ceasefire, but the new arrivals had carved their intentions into every step. I felt something in the male give way, an invisible strand snapping under enormous strain. His knees folded, and this time neither of us could hold him. He collapsed with a sound that felt like the forest losing its oldest pillar, his body trembling with the last fight his heart could muster. The female fell beside him instantly, pressing her forehead to his, her breath shuddering through the small space between them. I knelt on the other side, my hand shaking as I pressed him to his chest, desperate for a heartbeat that grew softer with every passing second. The agents formed a torn circle around us, their weapons lowering one by one, not by command but because witnessing love made violence impossible. The female lifted her head, her eyes glassy with the unbearable truth settling within them. She touched the male's face, then mine, her fingers lingering in a way that made clear what she was asking. She wanted to take him home in the oldest sense of the word, to the valley of stone markers where their ancestors slept. She wanted me to lead her there before the sedative carried her into the same darkness that had claimed him. I looked at the agents, waiting for them to deny her, but something had cracked inside them too. A man who had earlier threatened me now nodded, unable to speak. Another wiped his face with trembling hands, smearing tears into the dirt beneath his eyes. Even the man from the ridge lowered his gun, though whether from guilt or awe I never learned. Together we lifted the male onto the stretcher. His arm slipped toward the female as though searching for her even in death. The journey to the valley felt like walking through the inside of memory, dim, heavy, carrying the weight of something both sacred and ending. The female stayed close, her hand resting on the stretcher, her breath slowing into a soft, rhythmic pattern like someone humming themselves toward acceptance. The wind softened as we walked, brushing the treetops with a gentleness I had never noticed before. When we reached the valley, the ground stretched out before us like an untouched relic, scattered with ancient stones arranged in patterns older than any map. The female guided us to a hollow surrounded by high moss-covered slabs. There, she knelt and pulled the male into her arms, arranging his limbs with the reverence of someone preparing a final prayer. She lay beside him, curling her body against his as though returning to shape they had shared for decades. I sat near them, my hands restless in the cold earth, afraid the moment I blinked both would vanish into history. Her breathing slowed, then slowed again, and with one final exhale, warm against the male's chest, she joined him. The agents stood in absolute silence, their rifles forgotten at their feet. No one spoke. No one moved. The forest seemed to seal the valley with a hush, so deep it felt like a vow. We buried them beneath the stones they had chosen, covering their bodies with pine boughs until they looked as though they were simply sleeping under winter's blanket. As we finished, the man from the ridge cleared his throat, his voice shaking as he declared the site classified, but his words had no force. Every man there knew something larger than authority had taken root in that valley. I left the forest that night with the weight of their final breath clinging to my clothes. But as I reached the ridge, one of the younger agents touched my arm and whispered the only words that kept me from breaking entirely. "You were their witness. Don't let them be erased." And in the cold silence that followed, I understood the truth I had spent a lifetime carrying. Some secrets protect themselves, but some need a voice brave enough to keep them alive. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.